A humble servant with mud-caked boots who walked the palace halls would soon reveal a noble lineage that would shake the foundations of the kingdom's most powerful families. And the astonishing connection between a forgotten royal decree and a servant's worn silver pendant that had remained hidden for over 6 decades, all triggered by one peasant's unwavering dignity in the face of brutal mockery. The sun's final rays cast long shadows across Westmoreland Palace, as Thomas Fletcher stood silently in the grand hall, his worn clothes and calloused hands marking him as distinctly out of place among the silk-draped nobility that surrounded him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat pressed heavily against the stone walls of Westmoreland Palace as Jackson Reed stood motionless at the edge of the grand dining hall. At 32, the palace groundskeeper felt the weight of every noble eye upon him, the whispers barely concealed behind jeweled hands and crystal goblets. His patched wool jacket and mud-stained boots stood in stark contrast to the silks and velvets that adorned the assembled aristocracy, celebrating Duke William Montgomery's annual midsummer feast. "I believe the servants' quarters are through the back entrance," sneered Lord Preston Blackwood, his voice carrying deliberately across the gilded chamber. The assembled guests tittered with practiced refinement as Jackson remained perfectly still, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "I was instructed to attend by Steward Harrison," Jackson replied softly, his voice carrying a surprising eloquence that momentarily silenced the nearest courtiers. "I'm to receive instructions regarding tomorrow's preparations for the royal until..." Lord Preston's hawkish features twisted into a cruel smile as he approached, his jewel-encrusted doublet worth more than Jackson would earn in 10 years of service. "Remarkable," Preston drawled, circling Jackson like a predator. "It speaks with almost perfect diction. One might almost believe it educated." The surrounding nobility erupted in laughter, crystal glasses raised in appreciation of the sport. Jackson's hand instinctively moved to the worn silver pendant that hung beneath his rough-spun shirt, a nervous habit he'd carried since childhood. The movement caught Lord Preston's sharp eye. "What treasure does our groundskeeper hide?" he questioned, reaching forward with manicured fingers to pull the simple chain from beneath Jackson's collar. "Perhaps the savage has stolen some trinket from his betters?" The pendant swung in the candlelight, a simple silver disc engraved with a pattern too worn to distinguish clearly. But to Jackson, it was the only connection to a past he barely remembered, left to him by his grandmother Eleanor Reed before she passed when he was only 7 years old. "Family heirloom," Jackson stated flatly, carefully tucking the pendant back beneath his shirt. "Nothing of value to anyone but me." "I should think not," Preston laughed, turning to engage his audience. "Though it's charming to think that peasants believe they have lineage worth remembering, as if mud and straw are noble materials from which to construct a family tree." Duchess Catherine Montgomery, observing from her elevated position at the head table, found her gaze lingering on the solemn groundskeeper. Something in his composed dignity, despite the cruel sport made around him, stirred a distant memory she couldn't quite place. "Enough, Preston," she called, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came with her position as the Duke's wife. "Mr. Reed has duties to attend to, and you're delaying both him and Steward Harrison." Jackson bowed respectfully toward the Duchess, a gesture performed with such natural grace that it momentarily silenced the hall. It was the bow of someone who understood the proper forms of court etiquette, knowledge unlikely for a simple groundskeeper. "Thank you, Your Grace," he replied, before turning to exit through the servants' corridor, his back straight despite the mocking gazes that followed him. Once alone in the dimly lit stone passage, Jackson allowed his shoulders to slump slightly, the weight of the encounter settling upon him. 25 years had passed since he'd come to Westmoreland as an orphaned child, taken in by the previous groundskeeper, Matthew Cooper, and his wife. They had raised him with unexpected kindness, teaching him to read and write alongside their own children. Unusual education for a servant, but Matt had insisted. Knowledge isn't just for those born in silk, the old groundskeeper had told him repeatedly. Your grandmother would have wanted you educated proper. Jackson's memories of Eleanor Reed were fragmented. A gentle voice, hands that smelled of lavender despite their calluses, and fierce eyes that blazed when she spoke of their family's history. Remember who you are, she would whisper before sleep each night. Not what they tell you that you are. After her death, he had been sent to Westmoreland with nothing but the clothes on his back and the silver pendant she had pressed into his palm on her deathbed. Keep this hidden, were her final words, until the time is right. For 25 years, he had obeyed without understanding why. Steward Harrison waited in the small antechamber adjoining the kitchens, his meticulous ledgers spread across the worn wooden table. At 68, Harrison had served Westmoreland Palace for over 40 years, watching generations of nobility rise and fall with the detached observation of someone who knew all secrets but revealed none. Another pleasant evening with Lord Preston? Harrison asked without looking up, his quill scratching methodically across parchment. As always, Jackson replied, settling into the chair across from the elderly steward. Harrison's eyes finally lifted, studying Jackson with unexpected intensity. You show remarkable restraint, Reed. Many would have been broken by less than what you endure. Jackson shrugged. What purpose would reacting serve? I need this position. The old steward's gaze lingered on the barely visible chain around Jackson's neck. That pendant, you've worn it since you arrived as a boy. Family heirloom, you've always said. The only thing I have from my grandmother. Harrison nodded slowly, closing his ledger with deliberate care. The royal hunting party arrives tomorrow. 14 nobles, including His Majesty. You'll need to prepare the east grounds and ensure the stables are ready by dawn. He paused, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. The royal archivist, Dr. Alexandra Carter, travels with them. Remarkable woman, dedicated her life to restoring historical documents damaged in the National Archive fire 30 years ago. Jackson nodded, uncertain why the steward shared this seemingly irrelevant detail. I'll ensure everything is prepared to standard. See that you do, Harrison replied, his tone suddenly formal as footsteps approached from the corridor. And, Reed, perhaps wear that pendant outside your shirt tomorrow. The sunlight might reveal details worn away by time. Before Jackson could question this strange suggestion, Duchess Catherine entered the chamber, causing both men to rise immediately to their feet. Your Grace, Harrison bowed. How may we be of service? The Duchess waved away the formality with uncharacteristic casualness. I wish to apologize for Lord Preston's behavior, Mr. Reed. It was unbecoming of a guest in my husband's house. Jackson stood perfectly still, surprised by this unprecedented interaction. In 25 years, the Duchess had never directly addressed him beyond basic instructions regarding the gardens. No apology necessary, Your Grace, he responded carefully. I'm accustomed to Lord Preston's particular brand of humor. Catherine Montgomery studied him with unsettling intensity. Your pendant, may I see it? The request, phrased as a question but carrying the unmistakable weight of aristocratic command, left Jackson no real choice. With hesitant fingers, he withdrew the silver disc from beneath his shirt. The Duchess moved closer, her perfume of jasmine and cloves surrounding them as she leaned forward to examine the worn silver. The pendant was approximately the size of a small pocket watch, its surface decorated with an engraved pattern largely smoothed away by decades of handling. Only fragments remained visible, what might have been a tree, perhaps a bird in flight, and around the edge barely discernible letters. How long has this been in your family? She asked, her voice carrying an undercurrent of something Jackson couldn't identify. Generations, according to my grandmother. She gave it to me before she died. Your grandmother's name? Eleanor Reed, Your Grace. The Duchess inhaled sharply, her composure momentarily fracturing before she carefully reconstructed her aristocratic mask. Eleanor Reed, she repeated softly. From Northlake County? Jackson's pulse quickened. Yes, how did you— A coincidence of names, surely, she interrupted, releasing the pendant and stepping back. The Eleanor Reed I once knew would be much older now. She turned to Harrison with forced casualness. Ensure Mr. Reed is assigned to attend directly to the royal party tomorrow. His attention to detail would be appreciated. Without waiting for a response, the Duchess departed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her perfume and an atmosphere thick with unspoken questions. What was that about? Jackson asked once her footsteps had faded. What was that about? Jackson asked once her footsteps had faded. Harrison's weathered face remained carefully neutral. Perhaps the past coming to meet the present, Reed. Get some rest. Tomorrow will prove interesting, I expect. As Jackson departed toward the servants' quarters, the elderly steward opened a concealed drawer in his desk, withdrawing a yellowed envelope sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Across the front, in elegant script, were written instructions. To be opened upon the appearance of the silver pendant of the House of Northlake. After 30 years of safekeeping the envelope, Harrison broke the seal with trembling fingers. What he read caused the blood to drain from his face. After all this time, he whispered to the empty room, the old king's prediction comes to pass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn had barely broken when Jackson arrived at the east grounds, the summer dew still clinging to the immaculately maintained grass. He had spent a restless night contemplating the Duchess's strange reaction to his grandmother's name and Harrison's cryptic statement. Following the steward's unusual suggestion, he had deliberately worn his pendant outside his shirt, the silver disc catching the first rays of morning light. The royal entourage was expected within the hour, and Westmoreland Palace had been transformed overnight. Servants scurried across the grounds, hanging vibrant banners bearing the royal crest, while stable hands prepared 24 magnificent horses for the hunting expedition. Jackson oversaw final preparations with practiced efficiency despite his troubled thoughts. Reed, called a familiar voice. Steward Harrison approached, looking as though he too had passed a sleepless night. Deep shadows underlined his eyes, and his typically immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of haste. A word before the commotion begins. They stepped into the shadow of an ancient oak that predated even the palace itself. Harrison glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard before speaking in an uncharacteristically urgent tone. What I'm about to tell you must remain between us until events unfold as they must, he began. That pendant you wear, it's far more significant. Then you realize it bears the seal of the House of Northlake. Jackson's brow furrowed. Northlake? I've never heard of such a house among the nobility. You wouldn't have, Harrison replied. The House of Northlake was officially dissolved 63 years ago, its lands redistributed, its name struck from official records. But before that, it was among the most influential noble houses in the kingdom, and the greatest threat to the old king's reign. The distant sound of trumpets announced the approaching royal party, cutting their conversation short. Harrison gripped Jackson's shoulder with surprising strength. Dr. Carter, the royal archivist, seek her out, show her the pendant, ask about the Northlake Decree of 1962. Now go, we must take our positions. Before Jackson could demand further explanation, Harrison hurried away, leaving him with more questions than answers. The House of Northlake? His grandmother a connection to dissolved nobility? It seemed impossible. The royal hunting party arrived with the expected pageantry, 20 mounted guards in gleaming ceremonial armor, followed by King James himself, a robust man in his 50s, with a reputation for fairness that had earned him genuine popularity among both nobles and commoners. Behind him rode 14 members of the highest nobility, including Lord Preston Blackwood, whose expression soured visibly upon noticing Jackson among the receiving line of staff. "Your Majesty," greeted Duke Montgomery, bowing deeply as the king dismounted. "Westmoreland is honored by your presence." Formal introductions proceeded with practiced precision, each noble acknowledged according to rank and station. Jackson remained in his position, eyes downcast as protocol demanded for servants during royal receptions. Yet he couldn't help noticing a slender woman who rode slightly apart from the nobles, not dressed in hunting attire, but in the practical clothes of a scholar with several leather satchels strapped to her mount. Dr. Alexandra Carter, he presumed. As the formal welcome concluded and the nobles dispersed to prepare for the hunt, Jackson found himself assigned to assist Dr. Carter with her belongings. The royal archivist appeared to be in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and an air of quiet authority that required no aristocratic title. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said as he approached, surprising him with the use of his name. "Steward Harrison informed me you would be assisting me today." "Yes, ma'am," Jackson replied, taking the heavy satchel she handed down from her horse. "I've prepared a workspace in the East Library as requested." "Excellent." She dismounted with practiced ease. "I understand you have something of historical significance to show me." Jackson hesitated, glancing around at the bustling courtyard. "Perhaps when we reach the library, ma'am." Dr. Carter nodded, appreciating his discretion. As they walked through the palace corridors, Jackson became acutely aware of the contrast between them, the royal scholar in her fine, practical clothes and himself in his work attire, now clean but still marking him unmistakably as a servant. The East Library stood empty as promised, early sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate shelves of leather-bound volumes rarely touched by the palace's current occupants. Dr. Carter immediately claimed the large oak table at the center, spreading maps and documents from her satchels. "Now," she said once they were alone, her tone shifting from formal to intensely focused, "Harrison's message mentioned a pendant of the House of Northlake. May I see it?" Jackson withdrew the silver disc from his shirt, unfastening the chain to place it in her outstretched hand. Dr. Carter's breath caught. She reached into her pocket for a small magnifying glass, examining the pendant with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling priceless artifacts. "Extraordinary," she whispered. "The seal is authentic, though worn. The patterns are unmistakable." She looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" "My grandmother, Eleanor Reed. She gave it to me before she died when I was 7. "Eleanor Reed," she repeated, reaching for one of her satchels. "I suspected as much when Harrison's message arrived last night. I've brought something you need to see." She withdrew a carefully preserved document encased in a protective sleeve. "This is one of the documents I've been restoring after the National Archive fire. It's the official record of the Northlake Decree, dated May 14, 1962. A royal proclamation that was deliberately suppressed, the official copies destroyed, or so it was believed." Jackson stared at the document, its official seals and elaborate script marking it as a formal royal decree. "What does it have to do with my grandmother? Or me?" Dr. Carter's eyes held a mixture of academic excitement and human compassion. "The Northlake Decree formally recognized Eleanor Reed, daughter of Lord Thomas Northlake, as the rightful heir to the Northlake title and lands following her father's death without male issue. It countermanded the previous ruling that had stripped the family of titles due to alleged treason." She carefully turned the document to show him the details. The decree was signed by the old king on his deathbed, a final act of conscience. But when his son took the throne, it was suppressed. Those who had benefited from the Northlake lands being redistributed, including the ancestors of Lord Preston Blackwood, ensured the decree never saw the light of day. Jackson's world seemed to tilt beneath him. "You're suggesting my grandmother was nobility? That's impossible. She lived as a farmer's wife. I grew up in poverty after her death." "Not suggesting, Mr. Reed, confirming." Dr. Carter produced another document. "This is the birth record of Eleanor Northlake, who later took the name Reed after marrying a commoner against her family's wishes. And this," she laid out a third document, "is the birth record of her grandson, Jackson Thomas Reed." Jackson stared at the papers, his identity shifting beneath him like sand. If this is true, why would she never tell me? Why live in poverty if she had a legitimate claim? "Because claiming it meant certain death," came a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Duchess Catherine standing there, her formal hunting attire replaced by a simple day dress. She entered, closing the door firmly behind her. "Your grandmother and I were friends in our youth," she said, approaching the table, "though few alive remember that now. When the Northlake lands were seized, Eleanor was just 16. She escaped with the help of loyal servants, taking only that pendant as proof of her lineage." The Duchess's eyes held a sorrow that spoke of old wounds. Those who tried to uphold the decree were silenced permanently. Eleanor made the choice to disappear, to protect both herself and eventually you. But why would Harrison know about this? "Why now?" Jackson asked, struggling to reconcile this revelation with his understanding of himself. "Because of the King's recent Restoration Act," Dr. Carter explained. 6 months ago, His Majesty signed into law a process for reviewing historical injustices against noble houses. Steward Harrison has apparently been waiting decades for this opportunity. The door opened again, and Harrison himself entered, followed by a royal guard captain whose ceremonial armor bore the insignia of the King's personal regiment. "Mr. Reed," the captain said formally, "His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the Duke's study." Harrison's face was unreadable. "The wheels have been set in motion, Reed. The King awaits the last Northlake heir." Jackson looked down at the pendant now returned to his palm. The simple silver disc that had hung around his neck since childhood, its significance entirely unknown to him until this moment. The worn engraving that he had traced countless times with his thumb now revealed itself clearly in the library's light. An ancient oak with a falcon soaring above, surrounded by the words, "Truth endures beyond power." "I'm just a groundskeeper," he said quietly, "not a nobleman." The Duchess approached, her expression softened by something like regret. "You were never just anything, Jackson Reed. Your grandmother made sure of that. Even working the soil of Westmoreland, you carried yourself with the dignity of your bloodline." As Jackson rose to follow the captain, Dr. Carter carefully gathered the documents. "I'll accompany you. These records must be formally presented to His Majesty." They moved through the palace corridors, servants and nobles alike stopping to stare at the strange procession. The groundskeeper at its center, flanked by the royal archivist, the Duchess, the palace steward, and the King's guard captain. Word spread rapidly through whispers and significant glances. At the entrance to the Duke's study, Jackson paused, touching the pendant one last time before tucking it securely inside his shirt. A final moment as the man he had always believed himself to be. "Ready, my lord?" asked Harrison quietly, using the title for the first time. Jackson squared his shoulders. "No, but proceed anyway." The heavy oak doors of Duke Montgomery's study swung open to reveal a scene Jackson could never have anticipated. King James stood by the fireplace, his hunting attire replaced by formal royal garments. Duke Montgomery occupied a chair to the right, his expression unreadable. Most surprising was the semicircle of nobles already assembled, including Lord Preston Blackwood, whose face darkened with contempt upon seeing Jackson enter. "Your Majesty," the captain announced, "Mr. Jackson Reed, as requested." The king's penetrating gaze fixed on Jackson, studying him with unsettling intensity. Despite his common clothes and the dirt embedded deep in the creases of his hands, Jackson met the royal gaze directly, an instinctive response that caused several nobles to murmur at the perceived impropriety. "Leave us," the king commanded. The guard captain, who bowed and retreated. "All but those directly involved in this matter." Dr. Carter stepped forward, presenting her credentials before carefully laying out the restored documents on the Duke's desk. "Your Majesty, I've confirmed the authenticity of both the Northlake Decree and the pendant in Mr. Reed's possession. The seal markings, parchment composition, and ink formulation all date correctly to 1962. Lord Preston's face contorted with indignation. "This is preposterous. Are we truly entertaining the notion that this gardener has noble blood, based on some ancient paperwork and a trinket he could have acquired anywhere? The pendant has been in my possession since childhood, my lord," Jackson replied quietly. "Given to me by my grandmother before her death." "Ah yes, the mysterious grandmother," Preston sneered. "How convenient that she's not here to verify these absurd claims." The Duchess moved to stand beside Jackson. "I can verify Eleanor Reed's identity, Your Majesty. We were childhood friends before the Northlake dissolution. I recognized the pendant yesterday, though I scarcely dared believe what it might mean." King James nodded thoughtfully. "Lady Montgomery, your testimony carries significant weight, yet Lord Preston raises a fair concern about verification." "If I may, Your Majesty," Harrison interjected, stepping forward with the yellowed envelope he had opened the previous night. "I have served as keeper of this sealed document for 30 years. It was entrusted to me by your father on his deathbed, with explicit instructions that it remain sealed until someone appeared at Westmoreland bearing the Northlake pendant. He presented the letter to the king, who broke the secondary seal, his father's royal insignia, and read the contents with growing astonishment. "This is my father's hand," he confirmed, looking up at Jackson with new understanding. "It states that before his death, he signed the Northlake Decree restoring the family's honor, but discovered the document had been suppressed by certain factions within the court. He names those responsible and instructs that should the Northlake ever re-emerge, full restoration of titles and lands should be immediate." Lord Preston paled visibly. "Surely one cannot overturn 60 years of established ownership on the basis of ancient grievances. The Blackwood Northern Estates have been in my family for 3 generations. Estates," Dr. Carter noted pointedly, "that were originally Northlake lands redistributed after the false treason charges. The historical record is quite clear." The king refolded the letter carefully. "My father's final instruction was to right this wrong should the opportunity arise. The Restoration Act I signed 6 months ago provides the legal framework." He turned to Jackson. "However, claims to noble titles require more than documentation. There must be evidence the claimant possesses the qualities and knowledge befitting their station." Lord Preston's confidence returned. Precisely what could this man possibly know of history, governance, or the responsibilities of nobility? He digs in dirt and trims hedges. The Duke, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Perhaps we should allow Mr. Reed to demonstrate his qualifications rather than assuming their absence." The king nodded in agreement. "A fair suggestion. Mr. Reed, are you educated?" Jackson felt every eye in the room upon him. "The previous groundskeeper and his wife educated me alongside their children, Your Majesty. I can read and write in 3 languages. I've studied history, mathematics, and natural philosophy using books borrowed from the palace library during winter evenings." Disbelieving murmurs circulated among the nobles until Dr. Carter intervened. If I may, Your Majesty, I've observed that Mr. Reed organized my research materials according to proper archival principles without instruction. Few nobles of my acquaintance would recognize the correct chronological filing system for historical documents. The king's mouth twitched with suppressed amusement. And what of the responsibilities of land management? Would you know how to oversee an estate, Mr. Reed? For the first time, Jackson allowed himself a small smile. Your Majesty, I have effectively managed the 2,000 acres of Westmoreland for the past decade. While the Duke holds the title, Steward Harrison can confirm that decisions regarding crop rotation, forest management, waterway maintenance and tenant-farmer relations have largely fallen to me. Harrison nodded confirmation. Mr. Reed has essentially functioned as land steward in all but name, Your Majesty. The estate's productivity has increased by 30% under his guidance. Duke Montgomery cleared his throat. I can attest to the truth of this statement. My interests have admittedly been more focused on court matters than agricultural yields. Lord Preston, seeing his position weakening, changed tactics. Even if he possesses rudimentary knowledge, he lacks the bloodline. One pendant doesn't establish genealogy. The bloodline is clearly established through birth records, Dr. Carter countered, pointing to the documents. And if physical evidence is required, she hesitated, looking to the king for permission. There is another test, Your Majesty, the distinctive Northlake trait. The king's eyebrows rose in recognition. Ah, yes, the eyes. Jackson looked between them, confused. My eyes? The Duchess approached him, studying his face with new understanding. The Northlake heterochromia. I should have recognized it immediately, but it's subtle in your case. She turned to the assembled nobles. The Northlake line is famous for their distinctive eyes. One blue, one green. In Jackson's case, his left eye is blue, while his right contains a partial segment of green. A muted version of the trait, but unmistakable once you look for it. The king stepped closer, examining Jackson's eyes for himself. Indeed. My father's letter mentions this specifically as final confirmation of identity. He straightened, his decision evidently made. Dr. Carter, please proceed with formal verification of the documents. Lord Chancellor Morris will prepare the restoration declaration. Lord Preston's face flushed deep crimson. Your Majesty, I must protest. The Northern Territories have been developed under Blackwood stewardship for generations. To simply hand them over to an untested— Not all the territories, Lord Preston, the king interrupted sharply. Only the portions explicitly named in the Northlake Decree. According to these maps, approximately 40% of your current holdings. A significant loss, certainly, but hardly destitution for a house of your wealth. The assembled nobility watched the confrontation with barely concealed fascination. The humbling of the arrogant Lord Preston by a former servant made for the kind of court drama that would fuel gossip for months. Furthermore, the king continued, the transition will occur over 1 year, allowing for proper preparation and minimal disruption to tenant farmers. The Restoration Act specifically provides for such arrangements. Jackson, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Your Majesty, while I am grateful for this recognition of my family's rightful place, I have no desire to disrupt the lives of those who work the land. I would propose a modified arrangement. The room fell silent, nobles exchanging glances at this unprecedented situation. A man who had been a servant that morning, now negotiating terms with the king himself. I'm listening, Mr. Reed, the king said with genuine curiosity. The formal restoration of the Northlake title is a matter of justice and historical truth, Jackson began, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. But the Northern Territories have been developed under Blackwood management for generations, as Lord Preston notes. I propose that rather than transferring direct ownership of all lands, a shared stewardship arrangement might better serve both historical justice and practical continuity. He turned to face Lord Preston directly. The tenant farmers and villagers shouldn't suffer disruption because of centuries-old court politics. I would be satisfied with recognition of the Northlake title, restoration of the ancestral manor house and immediate grounds, plus a percentage of the territory's revenues to rebuild the estate, leaving Lord Preston as acting administrator of the remaining lands under Northlake oversight. The King's expression showed genuine approval, a remarkably measured proposal. Lord Preston, you're being offered generous terms. Preston's face registered shock, followed by calculation as he realized the political impossibility of his position. With the King clearly supporting the restoration and documentation proving the historical injustice, outright opposition would only damage his standing further. I would need to review the specific terms, he managed stiffly. Of course, the King agreed. Lord Chancellor Morris will oversee the negotiations. He turned back to Jackson. Until the formal restoration ceremony, you will be housed in the royal guest quarters and provided appropriate attire. Tutorials on current court protocol will be arranged. The reality of his changed circumstances finally seemed to hit Jackson fully. Your Majesty, this morning I was scheduled to oversee the grounds for the royal hunt. Who will— Harrison stepped forward. The assistant groundskeeper has been informed of the changed circumstances, my lord. The estate will continue functioning in your absence. The use of the title, my lord, from the man who had been his superior for decades, rendered Jackson momentarily speechless. The King regarded him with unexpected warmth. I suspect you have much to process, Lord Northlake. We will reconvene tomorrow to begin formal proceedings. He addressed the assembled nobility. Until then, this matter remains within this circle. The official announcement will come from the Royal Chancellery. As the nobles began filing out, many casting curious glances at Jackson, Lord Preston approached him directly. The arrogance had not entirely left his bearing, but it was tempered now with wary respect. You could have demanded everything, he said quietly. Why didn't you? Jackson touched the silver pendant now hanging openly against his chest. Because nobility isn't about taking everything you can, Lord Preston. It's about responsible stewardship. He met the Lord's gaze steadily. My grandmother taught me that, even while living as a farmer's wife. Preston departed without response, but the slight inclination of his head suggested the first acknowledgement of Jackson as something approaching an equal. Dr. Carter gathered her precious documents, securing them in a leather portfolio. The historical records will need updating, Lord Northlake. Perhaps you might visit the National Archives once you're settled. Your grandmother's full story should be properly preserved. My grandmother's story, Jackson replied, the weight of the day's revelations finally settling on his shoulders, is apparently just beginning to be told. The royal guest quarters felt impossibly vast to Jackson as he stood alone in the center of the main chamber. Ornate tapestries adorned walls that could have contained his entire servants' quarters 6 times over. A 4-poster bed draped in blue silk dominated one wall, while a private sitting area with plush chairs surrounded a marble fireplace. A separate dressing room revealed a wardrobe already filled with clothing in his size. The King's efficiency at work. A soft knock at the door interrupted his dazed contemplation. Enter, he called, the word feeling strange in his mouth. He had always been the one knocking, awaiting permission. The door opened to reveal 3 palace servants he recognized, Michael from the kitchens, Diana from housekeeping, and young Thomas, a stable boy who'd often assisted Jackson with the grounds. They stood in the doorway, uncertainty written across their faces. We've been assigned to attend to your needs, my lord, Michael said, the title clearly uncomfortable on his tongue when addressing a man he'd shared ale with just last week. Please don't, Jackson said immediately. "I'm still Jackson to you." The servants exchanged glances. "The protocol master was quite specific, my lord," Diana replied carefully. "Proper forms of address are required." Jackson sighed, recognizing the impossible position they were in. Breaking protocol could cost them their positions, especially with the palace currently hosting the king himself. "Then perhaps we can compromise," he suggested. "When we're in public or formal settings, use the proper address. But when we're alone like this, I'd prefer my name." Relief visibly washed over the three servants. "That seems reasonable, Jackson," Michael ventured with a tentative smile. Thomas, the youngest and least versed in court etiquette, burst out with the question clearly burning in all their minds. "Is it true you're actually a lord? Everyone below stairs is talking about nothing else." "Thomas!" Diana hissed, mortified by the breach of propriety. But Jackson laughed, the first genuine laugh since this whirlwind began. "Apparently so, though I'm as surprised as anyone. Yesterday I was trimming hedges, and today—" He gestured to the opulent room. "The master tailor will arrive within the hour for final fittings," Diana informed him, professional demeanor returning. "And Protocol Master Winters has requested to begin your court etiquette lessons immediately after." Jackson nodded, the reality of his new position settling over him like an ill-fitting coat. He would need to learn years of protocol and custom in a matter of days before the formal restoration ceremony. "There's something else you should know," Michael added hesitantly. "Lord Preston has been speaking with other nobles. Some are resistant to the idea of a former servant joining their ranks." "I imagined as much," Jackson replied. 25 years of serving their dinners and tending their gardens doesn't disappear overnight, simply because my grandmother's lineage has been recognized." A more authoritative knock interrupted their conversation. The door opened to reveal Steward Harrison, now regarding Jackson with the formal deference his new position demanded, though his eyes held the same shrewd intelligence as always. "My lord, Protocol Master Winters awaits your convenience in the blue salon," he announced. To the servants he added, "That will be all for now." As they departed with formal bows that still felt absurd to Jackson, Harrison closed the door and allowed his rigid posture to relax slightly. "How are you managing, Reed?" he asked, momentarily slipping into their old familiar address. "Overwhelmed," Jackson admitted. "Yesterday my greatest concern was preparing the East Gardens for the royal hunt. Today I'm negotiating land rights with Lord Preston." Harrison's weathered face softened. "For what it's worth, you've handled this transition with more grace than most born to nobility would show if suddenly thrust into your former position." "I keep thinking about my grandmother," Jackson confessed, moving to the window that overlooked the very gardens he had tended for decades. "She never spoke of any of this. She raised me to work hard, to read whenever possible, to treat all people with dignity regardless of their station, but never a word about noble heritage." "She protected you," Harrison replied simply. "Those who benefited from the Northlake dissolution would have ensured no heir ever reached adulthood to challenge them. Your grandmother understood this, so she raised you away from court politics, instilling the values of nobility without the title." This perspective had never occurred to Jackson. "You think she planned for this moment, for me to eventually reclaim the title?" "Perhaps not specifically," Harrison mused, "but she ensured you'd be worthy of it, should the opportunity ever arise. Teaching you to read and write when most servants remained illiterate, giving you the pendant as proof of lineage. These were deliberate choices." A new thought struck Jackson. "The previous groundskeeper, Matthew Cooper, who took me in, after my grandmother died, did he know?" Harrison's slight smile confirmed Jackson's suspicion. "Matt was one of the few remaining Northlake loyalists. When your grandmother realized she was dying, she contacted him through old networks. Your placement at Westmoreland was no accident, Reed." The revelation that his life's path had been shaped by such careful planning left Jackson momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, Another knock announced the arrival of the royal tailor, a fussy, precise man who immediately began circling Jackson like an artist contemplating a canvas. "You have an excellent frame, my lord," the tailor declared, measuring tape flying as his assistants noted dimensions. "Strong shoulders, good posture, will have you looking the part by evening." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. After the tailor came Protocol Master Winters, a severe, thin man with impeccable posture, who drilled Jackson on proper forms of address, seating arrangements, and the intricate dance of court etiquette. "A peer of your rank bows to the king." And thus, Winters demonstrated, bending precisely at the waist. "To other nobles of equal rank, the inclination is less pronounced. To those of lower rank, a simple nod suffices." Jackson, who had spent decades perfecting the servant's bow, deep, eyes downcast, now struggled with the subtle variations that would mark him as nobility. Wrong movements ingrained from years of service needed to be unlearned in hours. By late afternoon, his head swimming with protocols and measurements, Jackson was granted a brief respite before the evening's small formal dinner. An opportunity for the king to observe him in a controlled social setting before the public announcement. Alone again, Jackson found himself drawn to the ornate writing desk by the window. Parchment, quills, and sealing wax had been provided, all the accoutrements of noble correspondence. On impulse, he sat and began to write, the words flowing from some deep place within. To the memory of Eleanor Reed, born Eleanor Northlake, grandmother, "Today I discovered who you truly were, and in doing so began to understand who I might become. The pendant I thought merely sentimental was your message across time. The lessons I thought simply wisdom were your preparation for this moment. I sit in a royal chamber surrounded by luxury, yet I find myself missing the simplicity of your small cottage, the wisdom in your garden rough hands, and the stories you told by candlelight. I never knew those stories were your own history, disguised as fables to protect a child too young to keep secrets. Tomorrow, I will begin the process of reclaiming your family's legacy. I promise to do so with the same quiet dignity you maintained even when living as a farmer's wife, far from the privilege of your birth. Your grandson, Jackson Reed." Northlake, he had just finished writing when a knock announced the arrival of Dr. Carter carrying a leather portfolio. "Lord Northlake," she greeted him, the title still unfamiliar to his ears. "I've brought something you should see before this evening's dinner." From the portfolio, she withdrew a carefully preserved portrait miniature, a young woman with striking heterochromatic eyes, one blue and one vivid green, her expression proud yet gentle. "Eleanor Northlake at 16, Dr. Carter explained. "Painted just before the dissolution. I found it in the Royal Archives this afternoon." Jackson stared at the portrait, finally seeing his grandmother as she had been before hardship and hiding had reshaped her life. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. The same strong jaw, the same slight asymmetry to the smile. "There's more," Dr. Carter continued, producing a folded document. "I've been researching the original treason charges against the Northlake family. They were fabricated as we suspected, but the motivation was more complex than simple land acquisition." She spread out a genealogical chart on the desk. "Your great-grandfather, Lord Thomas Northlake, was the old king's cousin through a maternal line. The treason charges were manufactured to eliminate a potential rival claim to the throne, distant but legitimate." Jackson looked up sharply. "Are you suggesting—" "No," Dr. Carter interrupted quickly. "Your grandmother's line was far too removed for any realistic claim, but it explains the thoroughness with which the Northlake family was erased from official records. It wasn't just about land redistribution. It was about eliminating even the memory of an alternate royal connection." This revelation added new layers to Jackson's understanding of his grandmother's caution. She had been protecting him, not just from those who had claimed Northlake lands, but from deeper political dangers. A final knock announced the arrival of the royal valet, bearing the finished formal attire for the evening's dinner. The transformation from groundskeeper to nobleman would now be completed, at least in outward appearance. "Will you be attending the dinner, Dr. Carter?" Jackson asked as she gathered her documents. "Yes," she confirmed. "The king has requested. I present my findings to the assembled nobles. Historical validation of your claim is an essential part of the restoration process." As the valet helped Jackson into clothing finer than any he had ever worn, a midnight blue jacket with silver embroidery, charcoal trousers, and a crisp white shirt with more buttons than seemed practical, he caught his reflection in the full-length mirror. The man who stared back was simultaneously familiar and foreign. His face remained unchanged, the same weathered features shaped by years working outdoors, but the formal attire transformed his bearing, revealing an inherent dignity that had always been present, merely disguised by servants' clothing. Around his neck, now displayed prominently against the white shirt rather than hidden, hung the silver pendant, the physical link between the groundskeeper he had been and the nobleman he was becoming. He touched it briefly, a silent acknowledgement of his grandmother's foresight. "It's time, my lord," the valet announced, opening the chamber door. Jackson squared his shoulders and stepped forward to face the nobility, not as a servant, but as their peer, a transition as much internal as external, yet still only beginning. The grand dining hall of Westmoreland Palace had always been a realm Jackson observed but never truly entered. For 25 years, he had glimpsed its splendor only while delivering fresh-cut flowers or reporting to the steward. He had served its perimeter, polished its windows, and even rescued a noble lady's pampered lapdog that had wandered onto the grounds, but he had never sat at the gleaming mahogany table that dominated the space. Tonight, that would change. Protocol. Master Winters escorted him through the palace corridors, providing last-minute guidance in hushed tones. "You'll be seated to the Duchess's left, a position of honor that reflects both your restored rank and the King's favor. The first toast will come from His Majesty. You need only raise your glass in response, no words required." Jackson nodded, attempting to commit each instruction to memory while simultaneously managing the unfamiliar weight of formal attire and the curious stares of every servant they passed. News of his transformation had spread throughout the palace with the speed only possible in a household where information was the most valuable currency. "Above all," Winters continued, "remember that you are now Lord Northlake. Whatever you may have been yesterday is immaterial to your conduct tonight." They paused before the towering doors of the dining hall, where two livered footmen stood at attention. Through the wood, Jackson could hear the murmur of aristocratic voices, the same nobles who had previously looked through him as if he were invisible, now awaiting his entrance as a peer. "Ready, my lord?" Winters asked quietly. Jackson straightened his spine, feeling the weight of his grandmother's pendant against his chest. "Proceed." The doors swung open and the announcement rang out, "Lord Jackson Northlake, heir to the House of Northlake." The room fell silent as every head turned toward the entrance. 22 nobles, the king himself, and various court officials, all staring at the man who had, until that morning, trimmed the hedges and tended the grounds of Westmoreland Palace. Jackson entered with measured steps, focusing on maintaining the precise pace Winters had drilled into him. Neither the hurried gait of a servant nor the languid stroll affected by certain nobles. His eyes remained level, acknowledging the assembly without the downward cast that had been ingrained through decades of service. King James rose from his position at the head of the table, a gesture that prompted all others to stand as well. "Lord Northlake, welcome. Please join us." Jackson approached the empty chair beside the Duchess, bowing to the king with the precise inclination Winters had demonstrated, a peer's respect rather than a servant's deference. As he took his seat, he was acutely aware of the mixture of expressions surrounding him: curiosity, skepticism, disdain, and from a few, cautious respect. Lord Preston Blackwood, seated directly across from him, maintained a rigid countenance that revealed nothing of his thoughts. The irony of their positions, facing each other as equals across the very table where Preston had mocked him less than 24 hours earlier, seemed lost on no one. An historic occasion, the king declared, raising his glass. The restoration of a noble house long removed from its rightful place, to Lord Northlake and the righting of past wrongs. The assembled company raised their glasses, though Jackson noted several did so with minimal enthusiasm. The Duchess, however, touched her glass to his with a genuine smile. "To new beginnings," she added quietly. As the first course was served, Jackson found himself navigating not just unfamiliar table settings, the bewildering array of silverware Winters had hastily explained, but the even more treacherous waters of aristocratic conversation. Questions came from all directions, some innocuous, others carrying subtle barbs. "Tell us, Lord Northlake," began Lady Victoria Harrington, an elderly dowager whose family connections made her nearly untouchable in court politics. "What was your first thought upon discovering your elevated heritage?" Jackson selected his fork carefully, remembering Winter's instruction to work from the outside in. "That my grandmother's insistence on my education suddenly made perfect sense, my lady. She taught me to read when I was barely walking and insisted I learn mathematics and history despite our circumstances." Lady Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what circumstances were those, precisely?" "We lived simply," Jackson replied, meeting her gaze directly. "A small cottage on the edge of Oakridge County. My grandmother supported us through her knowledge of medicinal herbs and by teaching the local children to read and cipher. A village schoolmistress," Lady Harrington mused, the words carrying a subtle dismissal. "How pastoral." "My grandmother was many things, my lady," Jackson responded, evenly, including patient enough to recognize that some nobility of character requires no title to validate it. A charged silence followed this response, broken by a surprised chuckle from the king. "Well said, Lord Northlake. Lady Harrington, I believe. That addresses your question adequately." The elderly noblewoman inclined her head, acknowledging the royal rebuke with practiced grace, though her sharp eyes suggested she had merely been testing the newcomer's composure. As the meal progressed, through its 7 elaborate courses, Jackson maintained a careful balance between observation and participation. He noted which nobles spoke directly to him, which avoided his gaze entirely, and which watched with calculating assessment. Court politics were revealing themselves in miniature through these interactions, factions and alliances becoming visible through patterns of conversation. "I understand you've proposed a compromise regarding the Northern Territories," remarked Lord Chancellor Morris during the fish course. "Rather unusual for someone in your position to offer concessions before negotiations have properly begun." Jackson took a sip of wine, buying a moment to compose his response. "I see it less as concession and more as practical governance, Lord Chancellor. The lands have been managed under Blackwood's supervision for 3 generations. Disrupting that established order serves no one, not the tenant farmers, not the local economy, and not the stability of the region. A surprisingly nuanced view for someone who tended gardens until this morning," observed Lord Ellis Chamberlain, a middle-aged peer known for his diplomatic skills. "Perhaps it comes from being the one who actually walked those gardens, my lord." Jackson replied, "Theoretical knowledge has value, but direct experience with the land and those who work it provides insights that reports and ledgers cannot." Dr. Carter, seated further down the table, smiled approvingly at this response. Lord Northlake demonstrates precisely why the Restoration Act is so important, gentlemen. Noble perspective combined with practical knowledge. A historically valuable combination. Lord Preston, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the meal, finally spoke. One might argue that practical knowledge alone doesn't qualify one for noble responsibilities. Generations of careful education and preparation didn't prevent your grandfather from mismanaging the eastern forests to the point of nearly triggering a regional famine in 1992. Jackson interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. The clear-cutting was halted only because the tenant farmers collectively petitioned the Crown. A stunned silence fell over the table. That Jackson would have this specific historical knowledge, and more significantly, that he would dare reference such a black mark on the Blackwood record, was clearly unexpected. Preston's face flushed dark red. "You overstep, Northlake." "Not at all," Jackson replied calmly. "I merely illustrate that generations of careful education don't guarantee wise stewardship, just as humble origins don't preclude it. The eastern forests have since recovered admirably under your father's more measured approach, proving that learning from mistakes is the true mark of effective governance. This diplomatic pivot, criticizing the past while acknowledging subsequent improvement, caught Preston off guard, leaving him without a ready response. The king observed this exchange with evident interest. It seems Lord Northlake has studied the history of his ancestral regions quite thoroughly, despite his separation from them. The regional agricultural records were kept in the palace library, Your Majesty, Jackson explained. Understanding the full history of Westmoreland's surroundings helped me better manage its grounds. As the dessert course was served, an elaborate confection of spun sugar and fresh berries, the Duchess turned to Jackson with genuine curiosity. "Did you ever suspect? In all those years tending the palace grounds, did you ever feel that you were meant for something different?" Jackson considered the question seriously. "Not in the way you might imagine, Your Grace. I found purpose and dignity in my work. The gardens thrived under my care, but my grandmother instilled in me a sense that circumstances don't define worth. A philosophy I now recognize was her way of preparing me for either possibility, remaining a groundskeeper my entire life, or someday reclaiming our family's position." "A wise woman," the Duchess remarked. "I wish I had reconnected with her before her passing." "As do I," added an unexpected voice, the Duke himself, who had been largely silent throughout the meal. "Eleanor Northlake saved my life when we were children. A riding accident near the northern border. She fashioned a splint for my broken leg and guided my horse back to safety when no one else could find me." This revelation created another ripple of interest around the table. The personal connection between the Montgomery and Northlake families added yet another dimension to the unfolding narrative, and further legitimized Jackson's position among those still harboring doubts. As the meal concluded, and the company prepared to withdraw to the drawing room for brandy and further conversation, the king made a final pronouncement. "Tomorrow at noon, we will hold the formal restoration ceremony in the Great Hall. Lord Northlake will officially reclaim his title and begin the process of re-establishing his house among the nobility. I expect all present to attend and to welcome their peer with the respect his position commands." The message beneath the polite phrasing was unmistakable. Opposition to Jackson's restoration would be considered opposition to the crown itself. As the company rose, Jackson found himself momentarily alone with Lord Preston, who spoke in a voice too low for others to hear. "You may have won the king's favor, Northlake, but the nobility isn't governed solely by royal decree. Your true test begins after His Majesty returns to the capital." Jackson met Preston's gaze steadily. I was testing myself against far harsher elements while tending these grounds through 25 winters, my lord. Court politics may bite, but they rarely kill quite as efficiently as February frost. Preston's expression flickered with something approaching reluctant respect before he turned away to join the procession to the drawing room. Jackson followed, the silver pendant warm against his chest, a physical reminder that while he might be new to the title, the nobility in his blood had merely been dormant, not absent, like a garden waiting through winter for the proper season to bloom. Dawn broke over Westmoreland Palace with unusual activity. Servants hurried through corridors carrying freshly polished silver and armloads of flowers. The great hall, used only for the most significant ceremonies, was being transformed under the direction of royal event masters who had arrived with the king's entourage. In his chambers, Jackson stood motionless as the royal tailor made final adjustments to his ceremonial attire. The ensemble was far more elaborate than the previous evening's dinner clothes. A deep forest green jacket with silver embroidery depicting the North Lake crest, the oak and falcon that matched his pendant, paired with cream breeches and a silver waistcoat. A ceremonial sword hung at his side, its weight unfamiliar, but its symbolism undeniable. The traditional colors of House Northlake, explained Dr. Carter, who had arrived to brief him on the ceremony. Green for the forests that formed the heart of your ancestral lands, silver for the river that borders the Northern Territory. Jackson studied his reflection, barely recognizing himself in this aristocratic finery. My grandmother wore these colors sometimes, a green shawl with silver threading. I never understood the significance. Another piece of her identity she preserved, Dr. Carter noted, arranging documents in her portfolio. The ceremony will follow traditional restoration protocol. First, the historical validation, my responsibility, then the testimony of living witnesses, followed by the King's formal decree and your oath of fealty. A knock at the door announced Steward Harrison, now dressed in formal attire, reflecting his elevated position within the household. My lord, I've brought something that may be of interest before the ceremony, he said, producing a small wooden box. This was entrusted to me alongside the sealed letter, with instructions that it be returned to the Northlake heir upon confirmation of identity. Jackson opened the box to reveal a signet ring bearing the same oak and falcon design as his. Pendant. The heavy gold band was sized for a man's hand, clearly not his grandmother's. It belonged to your grandfather, Lord Thomas Northlake, Harrison explained. Your grandmother managed to save it when the family estate was seized. According to a protocol, you should wear it for the ceremony. As Jackson slipped the ring onto his right hand, he was struck by its perfect fit. Another connection to the grandfather he had never known, but whose blood ran in his veins. There's something else, Harrison continued, his usual formality softening. The staff, those who served alongside you all these years, have requested permission to attend the ceremony. It's highly unusual, but the king has granted it. As a special dispensation, Jackson felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat. They're the closest thing to family I have now. They know that, Harrison replied simply, which is why they asked. Dr. Carter checked her timepiece. We should proceed to the antechamber. The ceremony begins in 30 minutes, and there are protocols to review. The final preparations passed in a blur of instructions and ritual rehearsal. Jackson practiced the precise wording of the oath, the exact movements required during the investiture, and the formal acknowledgments of each noble house that would be represented. At precisely noon, trumpets sounded throughout the palace, signaling the start of the ceremony. Jackson stood outside the massive doors of the great hall, Harrison at his side, waiting for the formal announcement. Nervous? The steward asked quietly. Strangely, no, Jackson replied. Yesterday I was. Today feels inevitable somehow. The doors swung open to reveal the great hall in its full grandeur. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the stone floor. Hundreds of candles in silver candelabras illuminated the space further, their flames steady in the still air. Along both sides of the central aisle stood the nobility in full ceremonial attire, a sea of velvet, silk, and family jewels that represented the kingdom's most powerful houses. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat King James on a ceremonial throne, flanked by royal guards in dress uniform. Beside the dais stood Dr. Carter with her historical documents, the Duke and Duchess of Montgomery as regional representatives, and Lord Chancellor Morris with the official scrolls of restoration. Most surprising to Jackson was the section to his left, where the household staff of Westmoreland stood in their finest uniforms. Michael, Diana, young Thomas, and dozens of others he had worked alongside for years, all present to witness his transformation from colleague to lord. The herald's voice rang out, presenting Jackson Thomas Reed, rightful heir to the House of Northlake, come to reclaim his title and ancestral honors. Jackson proceeded down the aisle alone, each step carrying him further from the life he had known and toward the destiny his grandmother had protected for decades. The weight of hundreds of eyes upon him felt tangible, yet he moved with the natural dignity that had always been part of him, now given proper context through title and attire. Upon reaching the dais, he knelt before the king as protocol required, head bowed in the precise degree Winters had drilled into him, respect without subservience. "Rise, Jackson Reed," the king commanded. "The proceedings of restoration now commence." Dr. Carter stepped forward first, her academic robes marking her official capacity. "Your Majesty, honorable witnesses, I present the historical validation of the Northlake claim." She methodically outlined the evidence: birth records establishing direct lineage, the Northlake Decree signed by the old king, land grants showing the original territories, and the sworn statements from royal archives, confirming the falsified nature of the treason charges. Furthermore, she concluded, physical evidence supports the claim beyond documentation. She gestured to Jackson's pendant and the distinctive heterochromia of his eyes. The hereditary traits of House Northlake are present and verified. Next came witness testimony. The Duchess stepped forward first, her voice clear and confident. "I, Catherine Montgomery, Duchess of Westmoreland, knew Eleanor Northlake in our youth before the dissolution. I recognize her features in her grandson and can personally attest to the authenticity of the Northlake pendant he wears." To Jackson's surprise, 3 elderly nobles he had never met also provided testimony, contemporaries of his grandmother, who had recognized the significance of the restoration and traveled overnight to attend the ceremony. "I served alongside Lord Thomas Northlake in the Mountain Campaign," stated one white-haired gentleman, using a cane for support. His daughter Eleanor had his same distinctive eyes, one blue, one green. "I see that trait, though subtle, in the man before us today. The bloodline is unmistakable." When the testimonies concluded, Lord Chancellor Morris unrolled the official restoration decree, an elaborate document with multiple royal seals and ribbons. By order of His Majesty King James, 4th of his name, the House of Northlake is hereby restored to the nobility of the realm, with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto. The false charges of treason laid against Lord Thomas Northlake in 1962 are formally expunged from all records. The hereditary title and designated lands return to the rightful heir, Jackson Thomas Reed, henceforth to be known as Lord Jackson Northlake. The Chancellor continued, outlining the specific territories to be restored and the transition arrangements negotiated with the Blackwood estate. Jackson caught Lord Preston's eye across the hall, the nobleman's expression carefully neutral. Though the tension in his jaw betrayed his continued displeasure, the king rose, signaling the most solemn portion of the ceremony. "Jackson Reed, Do you accept the title, lands and responsibilities of House Northlake, swearing to uphold the honor of your lineage and your obligations to crown and kingdom?" Jackson's voice rang clear throughout the hall. "I do so swear, Your Majesty. I accept the mantle of House Northlake and pledge to restore its honor through faithful service to crown and kingdom. Do you renounce all former claims and identities, embracing fully your rightful place among the nobility of the realm?" Here Jackson paused briefly, a deviation from the rehearsed script that caused a ripple of murmurs through the assembly. His eyes moved to the section where the palace staff stood watching. "Your Majesty, with respect, I cannot renounce the experiences that have shaped me. The years I spent as groundskeeper of Westmoreland taught me lessons of stewardship no noble education could provide. I embrace my rightful title and heritage, but I carry forward the wisdom gained through labor and service." A tense silence followed this unexpected response. Protocol Master Winters looked stricken at the deviation, but the king's expression shifted to one of thoughtful assessment. "Wisely spoken, Lord Northlake," he finally replied. "Your unique perspective may well prove valuable to the kingdom. I accept your amended oath." With these words, the king took up a ceremonial sword. Jackson knelt again, and the flat of the blade touched each of his shoulders in turn. "Rise, Lord Jackson Northlake, restored to your rightful place among the nobility of the realm." As Jackson stood, the Chancellor draped a ceremonial green cloak lined with silver silk over his shoulders, the colors of House Northlake now officially reclaimed. The pendant that had hung hidden beneath his clothes for decades now rested prominently atop his formal attire, its significance finally acknowledged. The king raised his voice to address the full assembly. "Bear witness, all present, to the restoration of justice long delayed. Let no person question the legitimacy of House Northlake restored, under pain of royal displeasure. Tradition dictated that the nobles now approach in order of precedence to formally acknowledge the restored peer. The Duke of Montgomery came first, extending his hand in the formal greeting between equals, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days before. "Westmoreland welcomes Northlake back to its rightful place," he stated for all to hear. "May our houses renew the friendship of old." One by one, the nobility followed suit, some with genuine warmth, others with carefully masked reluctance. When Lord Preston's turn came, the tension in the hall thickened perceptibly. Preston performed the formal acknowledgement with technical correctness, though his grip was unnecessarily firm. "Blackwood acknowledges Northlake," he stated, "the minimum required by protocol. I look forward to our cooperation in managing the Northern Territories, Lord Preston," Jackson replied evenly. "Our shared stewardship will benefit all who live and work those lands." The ceremonial acknowledgements complete, the assembly prepared to move to the great hall's adjoining chamber for the formal reception. As the nobility began to file out, Jackson made an unprecedented move. He walked directly to the section where the palace staff stood, uncertain of protocol in this moment. "Thank you for being here," he said simply. "Your presence means more than all the ceremony." Michael, the kitchen master, stepped forward with uncharacteristic boldness. "We served alongside you for years, my lord. It seemed right to stand with you today." Young Thomas, the stable boy, blurted out what others clearly thought. "Will you still visit the stable sometimes? Lord Northlake?" A smile broke through Jackson's formal demeanor. "I suspect I'll find my way there often, Thomas. Some habits of 25 years aren't easily broken." As he rejoined the procession toward the reception, Jackson felt the weight of the ceremonial cloak on his shoulders. Not just its physical presence, but the responsibility it represented. House Northlake lived again, its restoration complete. In name and title, the greater challenge now lay ahead, proving that a man raised as a groundskeeper could truly embody the nobility that had always run in his blood. 3 days after the restoration ceremony, Jackson stood in the courtyard of Westmoreland Palace watching as servants loaded his few personal possessions into a carriage bearing the newly recreated Northlake crest. The transition from groundskeeper to lord had occurred with astonishing speed, propelled by the king's direct involvement and the efficient machinery of royal administration. "The estate steward has prepared the manor house to receive you," Harrison informed him, reviewing a detailed ledger. "It's been maintained as a historical property since the dissolution, though not inhabited. The essentials are in place, but you'll want to make adjustments to suit your preferences." Jackson nodded, still adjusting to the reality that Northlake Manor, a property he had never seen, was now his ancestral home. The formal land transfer had been completed that morning, with Lord Preston grudgingly signing the necessary documents in the king's presence. "Have the tenant farmers been informed of the transition?" Jackson asked, his mind on the practical aspects of the change. "Yes, my lord. Royal messengers rode out yesterday to deliver the news to all villages and farms within the territory. The king's proclamation emphasizes continuity of operations during the transition." The Duchess approached, dressed for travel in a practical riding outfit rather than the formal attire Jackson had always associated with her. "Are you ready, Lord Northlake? The journey to your estate will take most of the day." Jackson had been surprised when Catherine Montgomery announced her intention to accompany him to Northlake Manor. "I knew your grandmother well," she had explained. "It seems fitting that I help introduce her grandson to his ancestral home." The Duke joined them, offering his hand to Jackson in what had become a much more natural gesture over the past days. "I've arranged for a proper household staff to meet you at the manor, experienced people who understand the unique circumstances. They'll serve you well during this transition." "Thank you, Your Grace," Jackson replied, the formal address coming more easily now after days of practice. "Your assistance has been invaluable." "Eleanor would have expected no less," the Duke replied quietly. "Our families were allied for generations before the dissolution. Restoring that connection honors both our ancestors." The royal escort, 8 mounted guards in ceremonial armor, arrived in the courtyard, signaling the imminent departure. King James himself appeared briefly to bid farewell, an extraordinary honor that underscored the historical significance of House Northlake's restoration. "Remember Lord Northlake," the king advised. "You bring unique perspective to your position. The nobility needs fresh viewpoints to remain relevant in changing times. Don't be too quick to abandon the wisdom gained through your unusual path." As the procession prepared to depart, Jackson felt a momentary pang at leaving the only home he had known for 25 years. His gaze traveled over the gardens he had tended, the hedges he had shaped, the grounds he had walked in all seasons and weather. "They'll still be here when you return to visit," Harrison said perceptively, following his gaze. "And I suspect your assistant groundskeeper will have many questions when you do." With final farewells complete, Jackson mounted the horse provided. For him, a magnificent black stallion from the royal stables, another gift from the king. The Duchess rode beside him with Dr. Carter just behind. The royal guards took position around them, and the carriage with Jackson's possessions followed. As they passed through the main gates of Westmoreland, Jackson caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the stables. Young Thomas, the stable boy who had attended yesterday's farewell gathering organized by the staff. The boy raised his hand in an uncertain wave, caught between the old familiarity and new formality. Jackson returned the gesture, a simple acknowledgement that bridges need not be burned simply because circumstances changed. The journey north took them through villages and farmland, past forests and streams that gradually became less familiar to Jackson as they moved beyond the territories he had known. Everywhere they passed, word had somehow preceded them, bringing curious villagers to doorways and crossroads to glimpse the restored nobleman who had once been a servant. "They're curious about the story," the Duchess observed as they passed. through a particularly crowded marketplace where activity had halted to observe their procession. People love tales of justice restored, especially when it involves such dramatic transformation. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable being a public spectacle," Jackson admitted. "You'll need to become accustomed to it," she replied pragmatically. "Your restoration is unprecedented in living memory. You represent hope that old wrongs can be righted, that justice, though delayed, can eventually prevail. That narrative carries power beyond your personal circumstances. As afternoon waned toward evening, the landscape began to change. The rolling farmlands gave way to more dramatic terrain, hills rising toward distant mountains, forests becoming denser, and a swift-flowing river appearing to their right. "The Silver River," Dr. Carter informed him, consulting a historical map. "The eastern boundary of the original North Lake territory. We're entering your ancestral lands now." Jackson felt a strange resonance as they crossed an ancient stone bridge, spanning the river, as though something in his blood recognized the land, even if his conscious mind did not. He had never traveled this far north, yet something about the quality of light through the trees, the particular bend of the river, felt oddly familiar. "Your grandmother used to speak of this bridge," the Duchess said quietly. "She said the stones sang to those of North Lake blood, an old family legend." Jackson didn't admit that he could almost imagine hearing such a sound, a faint harmonic vibration that seemed to come from the stones beneath his horse's hooves. They rode for another hour through increasingly beautiful country, mature forests interspersed with carefully managed farmland, small villages with distinctive architecture of stone and dark timber, and finally a long avenue of ancient oak trees leading to a rise upon which stood North Lake Manor. The manor house itself struck a perfect balance between grandeur and restraint. 3 stories of honey-colored stone with tall windows and a slate roof weathered to soft grey, not as imposing as Westmoreland Palace, but possessing a dignity and permanence that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. As their party approached, Jackson saw staff assembled on the steps, a formal welcome party awaiting their new lord's arrival. At their head stood a dignified older man who stepped forward as Jackson dismounted. "Welcome home, Lord Northlake. I am Edwin Chambers, estate steward. We are honored to serve the restored house of Northlake." Jackson shook the steward's hand, rather than simply acknowledging him with a nod, a gesture that caused a ripple of surprise among the assembled staff, but seemed to earn immediate approval from Chambers. "Thank you for preparing the house, Mr. Chambers. I look forward to learning about the estate from those who know it best." The staff exchanged glances at this unusually humble statement from a nobleman. The Duchess, observing their reaction, smiled slightly. Lord Northlake would clearly establish his own approach to nobility rather than simply adopting conventional patterns. As they entered the manor, Jackson was struck by both the familiar and unfamiliar aspects of his ancestral home. The layout followed classical principles he recognized from Westmoreland Palace, but with distinctive features unique to North Lake. Ancient tapestries bearing the oak and falcon crest hung in the main hall, alongside ancestral portraits dating back centuries. The Historical Society maintained everything in its original condition, Dr. Carter explained, as they toured the ground floor. When the dissolution occurred, the manor was designated a historical monument rather than redistributed, which preserved much of your family's heritage. In the main drawing room, Jackson stopped before a large portrait that immediately caught his attention. A young woman with one blue eye and one green, dressed in the formal attire of a noble daughter. The resemblance to both his grandmother and himself was unmistakable. "Eleanor Northlake at 17, the Duchess said softly. "This was painted shortly before the dissolution, the last formal portrait of her as a noblewoman." Jackson studied his grandmother's youthful face, the same proud bearing he remembered, but without the lines of hardship that had marked her later years. In the portrait, she wore an elaborate silver pendant identical to the simpler version he had inherited. She commissioned the simpler pendant before fleeing, Dr. Carter explained, noting his interest. A less ostentatious version that wouldn't attract attention, but would still serve as proof of identity if needed. After touring the main rooms, Steward Chambers guided them to the family library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing thousands of volumes. A massive oak desk dominated one end beneath a window overlooking the estate's eastern forest. This was always the heart of Northlake Manor, Chambers explained. Your ancestors valued learning above most other pursuits. The collection remains intact, another benefit of the property's historical designation. On the desk lay a single item, a leather-bound book with the Northlake crest embossed on its cover. Jackson opened it to discover a family history, chronologically documenting the Northlake lineage from its founding to his grandfather's generation. "There's a space for you," Dr. Carter noted, turning to the final pages where the chronicle abruptly ended with his grandfather. The Historical Society maintained the records, but couldn't officially add your grandmother's marriage or your birth, while the house remained dissolved. "That can be corrected now," the Duchess said, her tone suggesting the task carried significant importance. As evening approached, Jackson found himself drawn to a small, private study adjacent to the master chambers. Unlike the grander rooms of the manor, this space felt intimate and personal. A writing desk beneath a window overlooked the gardens, and bookshelves contained volumes that showed signs of frequent use rather than mere display. "This was your grandmother's favorite room," the Duchess informed him, following his exploration. "Eleanor spent hours here reading and writing. When we were girls, she would often escape formal gatherings to hide away with a book in this very spot." Jackson ran his fingers along the desk's smooth surface, feeling a connection across time to the grandmother who had protected him without ever revealing the full truth of his heritage. "Why do you think she never told me?" he asked, the question that had lingered since the revelation. "Even as an adult, when I could have understood the need for secrecy?" The Duchess considered the question carefully. "I believe she wanted to protect you from the burden of divided loyalty. Knowing your heritage while living as a commoner would have created a painful duality. She gave you the pendant, the means to reclaim your birthright when the time was right, but allowed you to live fully in the life you had, rather than yearning for one that seemed impossible." As darkness fell over Northlake Manor, Jackson stood at the window of what was now his private chamber, watching lights appear in the distant villages that formed part of his estate. Tomorrow would bring meetings with tenant farmers, local officials, and neighboring landowners. The practical work of restoring House Northlake would begin in earnest. On the bedside table lay his grandmother's pendant, the simple silver disc that had hung around his neck for decades, now resting beside the more elaborate original from which it had been copied. Two versions of the same identity, bridging the groundskeeper he had been and the nobleman he was becoming. "Not replacing," he murmured to himself, understanding finally what the king had meant. "Integrating." Outside his window, the ancient oaks of Northlake stirred in the evening breeze, their whispers seeming to welcome home the heir who had returned. At last, to the land that had always been in his blood, even when he had knelt in its soil with a gardener's tools, rather than stood upon it with a nobleman's title. 6 months had passed since Jackson Reed had become Lord Northlake. Autumn painted the forests surrounding Northlake Manor in brilliant hues of red and gold as preparations for the harvest festival neared completion. This year's celebration would be particularly significant, the first under restored Northlake leadership in over 60 years. Jackson stood at the edge of the great meadow where the festival would take place, watching as villagers erected colorful pavilions and arranged tables for the feast. Unlike many nobles who merely observed such preparations, he worked alongside them, his sleeves rolled up as he helped position the heavy oak tables that had been brought from the manor. "You'll scandalize the other lords if they see you laboring like a commoner," observed Steward Chambers, approaching with ledgers tucked under his arm. Though initially skeptical of his new master's unconventional methods, the elderly steward had gradually developed genuine respect for Jackson's approach to leadership. "Let them be scandalized," Jackson replied good-naturedly. "I found I govern better when I understand the practical realities of what I'm asking others to do." Over the months, this philosophy had transformed Northlake from a restored historical curiosity into a thriving estate that was quickly becoming a model for progressive land management throughout the region. Jackson had implemented innovations drawn from his years as groundskeeper: crop rotation techniques, water management systems, and forestry practices that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. Most radical had been his approach to relations with tenant farmers. Rather than simply collecting rents and making decisions by decree, he had established a council where village representatives could bring concerns directly to him, creating a collaborative approach unprecedented among the nobility. The quarterly. "Accounts are complete, my lord," Chambers said, opening one of his ledgers. "Revenue has increased by 22% compared to last year's historical averages. The new irrigation system for the eastern fields has proven particularly effective." Jackson nodded, pleased but unsurprised. "And the educational initiative? The new schoolhouse serves 63 children from across the estate. The teachers report excellent progress, particularly in reading and practical mathematics." This project had been Jackson's first major initiative as Lord Northlake, establishing free education for all children within his territories, regardless of their parents' status or wealth. The program honored his grandmother's work as a village teacher and reflected his belief that knowledge should not be restricted to the privileged. "Lord Preston's party has been sighted on the North Road," Chambers added, his tone carefully neutral. "They should arrive within the hour." The mention of Preston Blackwood sent a ripple of tension through the gathering. The Harvest Festival would mark the first formal visit of Blackwood to Northlake territory since the Restoration. Though the land transfer had proceeded according to the agreement, relations between the houses remained complicated. "Ensure they're received with full courtesy," Jackson instructed. "Whatever our past differences, today is about celebration, not conflict." As Chambers departed to make arrangements, a familiar voice called from behind. "Diplomacy sits well on you, Lord Northlake." Jackson turned to find Dr. Alexandra Carter approaching, travel-worn but smiling. The royal archivist had become a frequent visitor to Northlake Manor, dividing her time between the royal archives and documenting the estate's historical restoration. "Dr. Carter, welcome back. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." I finished at the archives early and decided to join the festival preparations. She gestured to the activity around them. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished in such a short time. The king will be pleased with my report." They walked together toward the manor, where final preparations for the evening's formal dinner were underway. Jackson had insisted the festival include both traditional elements, a feast for nobility in the manor's great hall, and more inclusive celebrations open to all residents of the estate. "There's something I've brought that I think will interest you," Dr. Carter said as they entered the family library. She opened her satchel and carefully removed a small package wrapped in protective cloth. "At least 20, my lord, a formal delegation by all appearances." In the courtyard, household staff had already begun assembling to receive the unexpected royal visitors. Jackson took position at the front steps, straightening his jacket and adopting the formal bearing now second nature after months of practice. The royal party entered the courtyard with ceremonial precision. Royal guards in full regalia, followed by officials bearing scrolls and sealed documents. At their centre rode an unexpected figure, Lord Chancellor Morris, the King's most trusted adviser and highest judicial authority. Lord Northlake, the Chancellor, greeted him with formal deference after dismounting. "I come directly from His Majesty with matters of significant importance requiring immediate attention." "Northlake welcomes the King's representative," Jackson replied, following protocol precisely. "Please enter and refresh yourself after your journey." Once inside the Manor's formal receiving room, the Chancellor dispensed with some of the formality. "I apologize for arriving unannounced before your festival, Lord Northlake, but circumstances demanded haste." "Is something wrong?" Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. "Has there been some complication with the restoration?" "Quite the opposite," the Chancellor replied, motioning for an aide to present a sealed document bearing the King's personal crest. "His Majesty has been following your progress with great interest. The success of Northlake's restoration and particularly your innovative approaches to governance have impressed him deeply." Jackson accepted the document, breaking the seal to reveal an official royal proclamation. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "This cannot be serious," he finally said, looking up at the Chancellor. "It is entirely serious," Lord Morris confirmed. "The King has appointed you Governor of the Northern Territories, with oversight of 7 counties, including your own. Your successful integration of practical knowledge with noble responsibility represents exactly the approach His Majesty wishes to encourage throughout the kingdom." Dr. Carter, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "If I may, this appointment is unprecedented for a newly restored noble house. It speaks to extraordinary royal confidence." The Chancellor nodded agreement. "Furthermore, His Majesty has appointed you to the Royal Agricultural Commission, where your expertise will help shape national policy." He paused, his expression suggesting more significant news to come. "The King also wishes to announce these appointments personally at a special session of court next month, where you will be inducted into the Order of the Silver Oak." Jackson sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the magnitude of these developments overwhelming him. The Order of the Silver Oak was among the highest honors in the realm, typically reserved for nobles with generations of distinguished service. "This is unexpected," he managed. "Perhaps to you," the Chancellor replied with the hint of a smile. "But those who have observed your transition from groundskeeper to lord have noted something remarkable. You've maintained the practical wisdom gained through years of service while embracing the responsibilities of nobility. That combination is precisely what the kingdom needs in these changing times." A commotion from the courtyard interrupted their conversation. The arrival of Lord Preston's party. Jackson rose, momentarily uncertain how to handle the convergence of these 2 significant visitors. "Perhaps," Dr. Carter suggested quietly, "there's poetic justice in Lord Preston witnessing the King's emissary delivering these honors. The man who mocked you in servant's clothing now sees you elevated beyond even his influence." Jackson considered this before shaking his head. "No, public humiliation, even of those who once humiliated us, solves nothing. We'll receive Lord Preston with appropriate courtesy and inform him of these developments privately, as one peer to another." The Chancellor's approving nod confirmed this was the right approach. "And that, Lord Northlake, is precisely why His Majesty has such confidence in you." As they moved to greet the second party of noble visitors, Jackson touched the silver pendant that still hung around his neck. The connection to his grandmother, who had preserved both his heritage and his humanity through her careful choices. That evening, the harvest festival proceeded with remarkable harmony. In the great hall of Northlake Manor, nobles who had once looked through Jackson as if he were invisible now raised glasses in his honor. Lord Preston, informed privately of the royal appointments, had responded with surprising grace. Perhaps, recognizing that the political landscape had shifted irrevocably, after the formal dinner concluded, Jackson slipped away from the noble gathering to join the village celebrations in the meadow. Lanterns illuminated tables laden with harvest bounty, musicians played traditional melodies, and dancers of all ages moved in circles around a massive bonfire. No announcement had been made of the royal appointments. That news would come later. Tonight was about community, about celebrating the land and those who worked it. Jackson moved among his people not as a lord above them, but as a steward among them, accepted in both worlds because he valued both equally. As midnight approached, he found a quiet moment to open his grandmother's journal, turning carefully to the final entry, dated shortly before her flight from the dissolution. I do not know if North Lake will ever rise again, or if the child I carry will ever know their true heritage. But I make this vow: if forced to choose between titles and character, I will always choose to build character. Nobility exists in actions, not merely in bloodlines. If my descendants someday reclaim our family's position, let it be because they first learned to serve with dignity, to work without shame, and to value wisdom above privilege. For that is the true legacy of North Lake. Not our lands or titles, but our understanding that true nobility begins with how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. Jackson closed the journal, his grandmother's words resonating deeply with the path he had walked. From the groundskeeper mocked for his ragged clothes to the lord now entrusted with governing an entire region, his journey had come full circle, proving that true nobility had always been within him, simply waiting for the right moment to emerge. In the distance, the celebration continued, bringing together all residents of North Lake, regardless of station, exactly as its lord believed it should be. The man once mocked by lords for wearing rags had indeed left the court speechless, not merely by revealing his hidden past, but by demonstrating that nobility of spirit transcends the circumstances of one's birth or the quality of one's attire. The pendant that had once been hidden now hung proudly visible against his formal clothes, a symbol of heritage reclaimed and wisdom hard-won through an extraordinary journey from servant to lord. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.